Britain was fighting a war it could not film, could not parade, and could not celebrate. Far below cheering crowds and scrambling fighters, the nation's real lifeline was bleeding out in silence. 3,000 feet underground, the war was being lost one shovel at a time. By 1941, coal production had collapsed by nearly 30 million tons from peacetime levels. This was not an inconvenience. It was an existential threat. Coal powered everything Britain used to fight. Steel mills, shipyards, railways, munitions factories, bakeries, and power stations. No coal meant no tanks, no ships, no bullets, no bread. The equation was merciless. Britain required 227 million tons of coal per year to survive the war. By the end of 1940, it was producing barely 197 million. Factories began slowing, then stopping. Power stations rationed electricity to weapons plants. Steam locomotives sat idle because fuel never arrived. Troops and equipment piled up, unable to move. Each weekly report to Churchill's cabinet was worse than the last. In early 1941, production fell another 2 million tons short. By summer, the deficit had grown to 5 million. One minister warned Britain might run out of coal before it ran out of soldiers. The irony was unbearable. Britain sat atop some of the richest coal fields on earth. Yorkshire, Durham, Wales, vast seams lay untouched. The problem was not the ground. It was the men. Conscription had drained the mines. Beginning in 1939, young miners fled underground life for uniforms and better pay. Who wouldn't? Mining meant darkness, dust-choked lungs, constant danger, and wages barely above survival. The armed forces offered escape, pride, and adventure. By 1941, more than 50,000 experienced miners had left the pits. Those who remained were older, worn down by decades of brutal labor. The average miner was nearing 50. Many were sick. Output per worker dropped sharply. Absenteeism soared. Entire seams lay unused simply because there were not enough hands to cut them. The government tried everything. Wages rose. Safety improved. Propaganda hailed coal as Britain's hidden weapon. Nothing worked. Voluntary recruitment failed completely. The tonnage kept falling. Something drastic had to be done. That decision landed on the desk of Ernest Bevin, Minister of Labor and a lifelong defender of workers' rights. He knew exactly what he was about to destroy. On December 2, 1943, Bevin stood before Parliament and announced a plan that stunned the nation. 10% of all young men called up for military service would not receive uniforms. They would be sent underground instead. Chosen at random. No volunteers. No choice. Their war would be fought in the dark. The outrage was immediate. MPs shouted accusations of slave labor. Military leaders protested the loss of recruits. Parents demanded answers. Bevin did not retreat. Britain needed coal more than it needed infantry. Selection was brutally impersonal. Conscription numbers were drawn by final digit. If your number matched that month's quota, you went to the mines. Grammar school students, clerks, apprentices, class offered no protection. They were mocked as Bevin boys, a name meant to humiliate but one that would never fade. Nearly 48,000 young men would be sent underground before the war ended. And for those whose numbers came up wrong, the war was only just beginning. And when their numbers were finally called, Britain's most unlikely soldiers discovered what that sentence truly meant. Parliament approved Bevin's scheme by a narrow, uneasy margin. The vote exposed deep fractures, but the alternative, industrial paralysis and likely defeat, was worse. Bevin gambled that the country would accept short-term injustice to avoid permanent collapse. Within weeks, the first call-up papers were issued, and Britain's invisible war gained its recruits. The envelopes looked ordinary. Official stationery. Formal language about duty to king and country. But where a regiment or training camp should have been listed, 3 words shattered expectations. Direction to mining. Geoffrey Mockford opened his letter in Portsmouth in January 1944, expecting the Navy. His father had fought at sea in the last war. His brother was serving aboard HMS Belfast. Geoffrey had imagined convoys and grey horizons. Instead, he was ordered to report to a Nottinghamshire colliery within 10 days, armed only with a rail warrant and instructions to bring clothes suitable for hard labor. There was no explanation, no appeal, just mathematics. Conscription numbers were assigned mechanically, based on when and where a young man registered. The Ministry of Labor selected certain ending digits each month. If your number matched, you went underground. Register an hour earlier, your fate changed. One digit separated men who would storm Normandy from those who would descend into coal seams. Chance alone decided. The shock spread quickly. Grammar school students, bank clerks, farmhands from counties without coal, all were sent to pits they had never seen. Experience meant nothing. Background meant nothing. Your number decided everything. Families struggled to understand. Mining was dangerous even in peacetime. Cave-ins, explosions, and lung disease killed thousands. Yet these deaths earned no medals and appeared on no casualty lists. Some parents insisted mistakes had been made. Officials patiently explained there were none. Mining directions overrode all other assignments. Refusal meant prison. A handful resisted and were jailed. Most went, not because it felt fair, but because Britain demanded it. Within days, the newly designated Bevin boys stood at pithead gates staring at machinery that would define their next years. Training was minimal and improvised. There were no purpose-built schools, only working collieries already stretched to breaking point. 4 weeks. That was all. Experienced miners trained for years. These boys had 28 days before being sent to production phases. Instruction focused only on survival, pit signals, safety lamps, roof supports, recognizing gas and unstable rock. Theory was useless. Mistakes were fatal. The physical shock was immediate. Coal seams were often less than 4 feet high. Men worked kneeling or on their sides for hours. Many trainees vomited from exhaustion and claustrophobia. Hands blistered, split, and hardened. Academic knowledge offered no protection when swinging a hammer inches from a collapsing roof. Veteran miners watched with a mix of resentment and pity. Educated accents underground sounded wrong. Questions were answered bluntly. There was no time for refinement. Only output mattered. By the end of the 4th week, the boys knew just enough to be dangerous. Production demanded bodies, not mastery. Ready or not, training ended. Then came the descent. Packed into metal cages, 40 men dropped nearly half a mile in minutes, darkness swallowing them whole. Heat rose. Air thickened. When the cage stopped, they stepped into tunnels lit by dim bulbs and coated in dripping mud. The walk to the working face bent them double, then forced them lower still. At the coal face, the seam measured barely 30 inches. In that space, less than the height of a chair, men were expected to fight Britain's war for 8 hours at a time. And the scale of what they powered was almost impossible to see from the coal face. Coal cut by Bevin boys did more than keep factories running. Some of it fed the Colossus computer, helping crack German communications and guide Allied strategy. The connection between a teenager wedged sideways in a 30-inch seam and intelligence officers breaking enemy codes was invisible, but absolute. Hospitals depended on it. After D-Day, wounded soldiers arrived from Normandy to operating theaters that stayed warm, sterile, and functional because coal-fired boilers never stopped. Aircraft factories relied on vast electrical output generated by coal. Aluminium smelters, engine works, and assembly lines that produced Spitfires and Lancasters consumed energy on a scale measured in cities, not buildings. Even uniforms traced back to coal, steam-powered looms, heated dye vats, and transport networks that clothed millions of soldiers. By war's end, Bevin boys had extracted roughly 45 million tons of coal. That fuel moved armies, powered command centers, ran radar stations, and kept Britain's industrial heart beating. Without it, the invasion of Europe would not have been possible. Victory came on May 8, 1945. Church bells rang for the first time in 6 years. streets filled with celebration. Soldiers returned to parades, medals, and gratitude. The Bevin boys stayed underground. Demobilization plans for the armed forces followed quickly, with clear systems for release, payments, and retraining. By Christmas, hundreds of thousands were home. The Bevin boys received none of it. Their essential work orders remained in force. Britain still needed coal, for rebuilding, for recovery, for survival. So while others celebrated freedom, they kept mining. Many remained until 1947. Some until 1948. Years longer than promised. No medals. No bonuses. No official thanks. When they asked about release, they were told bluntly that the war might be over, but not for them. The contrast was painful. Veterans received financial support, priority jobs, educational opportunities, and lifelong recognition. Bevin boys received nothing at all. Not even confirmation that their service counted. Requests for veteran status were rejected. Applications for medals denied. Officially, they were civilians, even though their service had been compulsory under threat of prison. Decades passed. Other wartime groups were remembered and honored. The Bevin boys were not. Many carried quiet shame, absorbing years of public misunderstanding until they began to believe it themselves. In 1979, survivors formed the Bevin Boys Association. They wrote letters, petitioned Parliament, and told their story again and again. Most appeals were ignored. The response never changed. Then, slowly, attitude shifted. By the early 2000s, Britain began reassessing overlooked wartime contributions. Campaigns gained traction. And finally, in 2007, the government acknowledged the truth. Prime Minister Gordon Brown announced official recognition. Badges would be issued. Not medals. Not veteran status. Just acknowledgement. By then, fewer than 3,000 of the original 48,000 were still alive. In 2008, elderly men stood at small ceremonies and received silver badges engraved with a miner's lamp and 2 words, Bevin Boy. Many cried, not from joy, but for friends who never lived to see the moment. It was too late for most. But it mattered. Because wars are not only won on beaches and battlefields. Some are fought in darkness, by men who never carried rifles, never wore uniforms, and were almost forgotten entirely. And Britain only won because they were there.